Hey everyone, before we get into the episode, I wanted to share an exclusive offer for CTC fans, followers, and listeners around our monthly subscription service, Admission. Now, normally that subscription gets you access to the huge library of tools and templates that we use at the agency, plus access to our private users forum and access to one-on-one coaching from a CTC expert who's trained in the type of thinking we're going to talk about today. However, if you sign up for 3 months of admission by the end of June, you'll get a discounted rate of $299 a month, and B, you'll get access to all of our products for no extra charge. That means you'll get the Enterprise Scaling Guide, normally $9.95 for free. You'll get the E-commerce Diagnostic Toolkit, normally $297 for free. You'll get our Media Buying Toolkit, free. TikTok Ads Playbook, free. And on top of all that, you'll get 3 free months of the D2C Index, which is our weekly overview of key metrics aggregated from hundreds of e-com brands. So we're calling this the Admission All Access Sale, which is more than $2,000 of bonus value for just $299 a month, which we think is a pretty good deal. So if you want to know more and you want to get started, just go to commonthreadco.com/all-access. That's one word, or you can check out the link in the show notes. All right, on to the show. Hey folks, welcome to the E-commerce Playbook Podcast. I'm your host, Richard Gaffin, Director of Digital Product Strategy here at CTC. Joined once again, as always and as ever, by Taylor Holiday, CEO here at Common Thread Collective. Taylor, how are you doing this fine day?
Doing great. Coming off of a wonderful Father's Day.
Oh, yeah.
And a day off for Juneteenth. So a really great weekend. I feel energized and excited.
Do anything special for Father's Day? Get any Father's Day gift packs, DOP kits?
So my wife, I'm going to go a little intimate here for the podcast listeners.
Right,
so my wife and I, part of what we're working on in therapy is learning to express what we want from out of life and from each other. This is sort of like a suppressed skill that you sort of almost feel guilty doing out of the upbringing, I think, in the world that I came from. And so we've done this thing where we're like, that my challenge was to go away for an hour and write down everything I wanted for the day, like in as much detail, and give myself freedom to just express selfishly exactly what I wanted. And so I did that, and I wrote, and it was an awesome day. It was great. So it included a little bit of personal time, a little bit of time with my wife, a little bit of time with the kids, some good food, some time at the park, date night, watching a crappy movie with some popcorn, a bunch of things that I just really enjoyed. So it was great.
Yeah. That's
a great exercise.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's interesting how much how we're so conditioned to think that getting what you want is generally a bad thing. That is interesting to have enough trust in yourself to actually write down everything you want and realize that if you were to get them all, that would be fine and everybody would be happy and it would be okay.
It's amazing. It's amazing how hard that is as an exercise. And it's funny, I just got off a call with a founder. I actually think, and we've talked about this on previous episodes, is that this in many ways is the fundamental flaw of all entrepreneurs, is they don't actually know what they're trying to do, because either it's bad to think that they want money. And so there's some sort of suppression around that idea. And so they take on some sort of like abstract missional idea that validates their guilt conscience or whatever. But getting clear on what you want and then discovering that it's available if you just ask is a really crazy insight.
Yeah. No, it's a powerful tool. Yeah, I was going to say my Father's Day was spent thinking about whether or not being the father of a dog counts. And I would say I would fall on the side of no. There's some responsibilities, but it's nothing like having a kid, that's for sure. But yeah, I was talking to, I think maybe I mentioned this on the pod once, but I was talking to somebody about having a puppy is kind of like having a toddler that can bite, which that seems really bad. Like they have sharp teeth. But then he came back to me and saying well, they don't have opposable thumbs, so your dog can't throw anything. So actually it doesn't count at all. And it's nowhere nearly as bad. But
yeah.
Anyway.
They have similar destructive capacity though. I mean, you leave them both in a room unattended, you're going to get similar results.
Yeah. No, totally. All right. Well, speaking of talking about things that we want, here's one thing that everybody wants, and particularly on our side, and is to create an environment within an agency where what we're selling is in fact a system and not a set of people. And those two things kind of come together. But this is a conversation that you've been having on Twitter, that we've been talking about internally here at CTC. Particularly, it's been framed in this sort of sense of we have, I think, become better and recently, I think, done a generally a pretty good job of taking the ideology, the framework behind how we think about e-commerce and turning it into product. And by product, we mean not only the digital products for which I am responsible, but also the
Yep.
actual service side, the tools that the people who execute the service here at CTC use to execute that service. And so, what I wanted to kick this conversation off by talking about is maybe get into a little bit of that conundrum that we were talking about
Yeah.
just before we hit record here, which is that generally speaking, the best case scenario when you hire an agency is that you happen to get the best people assigned to your account. And
Right.
oftentimes, what sort of it, maybe even generally in the world of hiring for ecom, just sort of generally speaking, it's like kind of becomes a crapshoot of like we were talking about it sort of like in baseball or in hiring or casting for a movie or something like that, where the only thing that you have going for you is talent, and so you have to pay
Mhm.
for that talent, and then, of course, whether or not you get that talent is sort of up in the air because it's not very predictable. And so the ideal is that what we sell is a framework and a fundamental base that anybody who works at our agency can grow off of and execute a good service, whether or not they themselves are the best person for or the best person in e-commerce or whatever. So maybe expand on that a little bit, Taylor. Like what are we talking about when we talk about the dichotomy between ideology and product?
Yeah. So over the last couple years, CTC went through a massive growth and retraction. I don't know how much we've talked about this on this podcast,
Hmm.
where one of the things as I've reflected on that I think we got out beyond was that we didn't have a ruthless commitment to a phrase we're calling internally organizational integrity.
Hmm.
So what does that mean? It means that there's an alignment between our beliefs and behaviors. That's what I think integrity is. It's an alignment between your beliefs and behaviors. And as an organization, we have a bunch of stated beliefs. Okay, let's just use an obvious, simple one for illustration that people sort of know us for cost caps. Okay, well, you would expect that based on our public ideology and our beliefs that we've stated, that our behavior inside of CTC accounts would be that everything is on cost cap. Now, that's not actually our belief, but the vast majority would be on cost cap. Well, there have been long periods where that is not true, where there is a misalignment between the behaviors and beliefs of the organization. And this shows up in lots of different ways, not just in Facebook media buying. But and it's because as a system grows, if you think that the ideology, let's just say for the sake of an illustration, is like at 100% at the core of the people who have been here the longest. So, Richard, me and you and our ideology about it might be like we are deeply saturated with the idea. We've spent many years together. We talk every week on a podcast. And so, if you interacted with either of us, you'd get a consistent
Yeah.
experience of the belief system of CTC. Well, the further you move away from us in the organization and the newer the person is to the organization, the less saturation they have in that belief system. They're a newer believer, if you will.
Hmm.
And so their knowledge of the holy text of CTC is like reflects a new person.
Right.
And so the more that somebody interacts with new people, the less their experience is consistent with the belief of the entire system. And as there was a point at which CTC grew to the point that I think like 60% of the employees had been here less than a year, right? And so when that happens, what occurs is that most of the experience of the organization reflects a low level of understanding of the core beliefs of the organization itself.
Hmm.
And so now you're in a place where organizational integrity is low. And this is the challenge when you're depending on just individuals to be the source of the system. And the reality is, when people hire CTC, they don't hire an individual media buyer. They often don't even know their name until they get introduced onto the call. They're hiring CTC because of CTC methodology that they've been sold in the sales process and in marketing material. And that's what they want. They want all the experience of the organization for all time, all the historical learnings,
Hmm.
all the wisdom, all the case studies, but no one person actually encapsulates all that knowledge. And so the question then becomes, well, how do you elevate your organizational integrity and how do you better productize and operationalize ideology? And so this is a thing that I've thought, spent countless hours trying to work through for myself and to think about how we do it better on this second really turn around the the sun, if you will, for CTC. So that's like contextually what I'm talking about is how does an idea like four peaks theory or, the growth equation or growth mapping or cohort specific LTV forecasting get consistently deployed inside of an organization? And I think that's what we're having the conversation about today. And then how does a brand evaluate an agency's ability to do that? I think is another important question we should hit on at some point. And
Yeah.
how do you, as an agency owner or operator, ensure that it's happening? So that's, I think, what we're trying to get after.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about then real quickly to kind of frame some of the rest of the conversation. Why do you think that agencies, and we're thinking because it's our industry and because we historically have been bad at this. Why are agencies bad at this? Generally
Yeah.
speaking, a lot of small companies are bad at this, but let's say why are agencies bad at this specifically?
So, one, you have to start by having a clear methodology that you can communicate succinctly and in a compelling way. That right up front is really hard to
Yeah.
do. Richard, you're a published author. We just this week went through your product, the e-commerce diagnostic, and you got to hear 12 different people experience it and the
Mhm.
ways in which it was unclear to them. And the reality is, creating and communicating with clarity is like an elite level skill.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
really, really hard to do. So that's like right up front is just creating the material in a compelling way that's easy to understand is hard. So taking complex ideas and boiling them down into understandable material is hard. That's problem number one. Now, I'd argue that's one of my best skills. It's one of your best skills. I think for CTC, we're pretty dang good at that. I still think there's ways in which the material is still unapproachable. It's too, riddled with acronyms and other
Mhm.
ways in which it needs a lot of work. But I'd put us up there pretty high at the creation of the material. Okay, but that's only step one. Now you actually have to operationalize it. And operationalizing ideology, that even the good kind, the kind that's really clear, is also really difficult. It requires very clear expectations of everybody in the organization to consume, understand, and be able to teach and deliver the material for themselves. So when you onboard someone into a system, I'll give you an example. CTC has a blog, CTC has a podcast, CTC has a YouTube page, and there have been moments where I'm willing to bet at CTC the amount of employees who had consumed or read any of that material was very low.
Mhm.
And yet, we're responsible for that material. That is actually what we are expected to deliver. And so you have to create an obligation for the consumption and understanding of the material. And you do that through training programs and onboarding, and you have to evaluate it. You actually have to create space to go, do you know this? Can you repeat it back to me? I have to give you feedback on your ability to repeat it back to me. Like, it takes a lot to actually indoctrinate people with your
Mhm.
material in a way that they can replicate it and apply it in variable scenarios, right? So the second step, so one is clear ideology. Second is you got to get the material read, consumed, and trained and understood in the head.
Mhm.
Okay. So that's like head knowledge is like the second piece of it. The third part is the application in multiple scenarios, right? So the hard thing about our world is that, to borrow from Range, the book, if anybody's read that, like business is a wicked environment. It's not a
Mhm.
kind environment. What do I mean by that? A wicked environment is one in which the variables are different every time. And so you can't just apply a templated format, or as Alex on Twitter likes to say, there's no best practices. Like there's no templated responses for every solution. So now you have to apply your head knowledge into practical novel areas. And that's about repetition. That's about the number of times that you can experience it over and over.
Mhm.
And so you have to combine all three of these things to get to a level of excellence of delivery of the information. So that means when an organization is full of lots of new people, for sure the third one doesn't exist because they haven't had
Mhm.
time. And the second one, in CTC's case, didn't really exist. And then the fourth part of it, so you've got the creation of the material, you've got the consumption of the material, you've got the application of the material, and then the last one is the measurement of the presence of the material.
Mhm.
So, are you actually applying it, and is the organization measuring itself? So, we have started doing this organizational integrity check where we take a set of ideology in an ad account or anywhere else, and we measure what percentage of accounts it's present in. And then we set goals around the leaders for the increase of the application of it. We're going to do this with the e commerce diagnostic toolkit. We're doing this. We do this for forecasting to accuracy, growth maps being built on time, cost cap percentage utilization, budget ratios, all these different things that we have ideas, marketing calendars completed and filled out. And we can actually track the presence of the ideas inside of the organization. So, how saturated are they?
Hmm.
So that's a whole system, right? That is very difficult to create, but it's what you as the brand should be evaluating. You should be asking people about their system and process for implementation of their ideology.
Hey everyone, Richard here again with a quick reminder that if you sign up for 3 months of admission before the end of June, you'll get every CTC product included for free. That includes the enterprise scaling guide, the e-commerce diagnostic toolkit, the media buying tools, and the TikTok ads playbook, and 3 months of the D2C index for free. So stop the podcast right now if you have to and go sign up at commonthreadco.com/all access, one word, or you can grab the link from the show notes. All right, back to it. Yeah. So I think like one thing that I hear when I hear those 4 steps, and one thing that we've struggled with, and I bet a lot of our listeners struggle with, whether they're from the brand or the agency side, is that all 4 of those steps require you to take a step back from doing day to day work in order to get those things up and running. So maybe like what
That's right. That's
now,
right. That's
because I will
right.
agree
Yes.
that we are definitely in a place now where we are better at this than we were before. So let's break down like what was the secret, insofar as there is
Yeah.
one, to getting to a place where we were able to take a step back from just letting people do whatever they can to get the job done, to get to a point where they are now learning how to get the job done first before going out to do it.
Slow down. One of 2023, I told our sales team that their new business expectation was $0. Now, it ended up not being $0. There was a lot of good things happening, but or sorry, for the marketing team, their responsibility was 0 SQLs, right? Like, they didn't have to drive any new leads,
Mhm.
because we were recreating what it meant to do education at CTC. And that included, Richard, your Q1 goal, which was build the e-commerce diagnostic product. Like, so you were given space to not have obligation to present value creation for future value creation. We've also more and more depended on people who are not employees on the service side to create the assets of the operation of the organization. So Niels and Qua are 2 examples of this. So Qua is the CTO of Statless. He doesn't do client work. He builds Statless. It's a core operating tool that brings to life our ideology. Niels is a person that works exclusively on the tools of CTC. He builds the growth map, and that's his job. He's not responsible to the client. He's responsible to the product. And so more and more, I think about CTC in a lot of ways like a software business where there's a product manager for something that's responsible. So Richard, I think see you is responsible for the e-commerce diagnostic product. I see Steve is responsible for the DC index. I see Qua responsible for Statless. I see Niels responsible for the growth map. I see Aileen responsible for the marketing calendar. I see like there's all these people that have this responsibility to the systems. I see Trent is responsible for the ideology of our media buying. Like there's just these different spaces in which there's somebody that has a responsibility to a tenant of the system and they get to spend time improving that product more than the individual application of that product inside of the system.
Mhm. Here's a question: how difficult was it for, or how much of a leap of faith, let's say, was it for you to make the decision for us on the marketing side to not drive any new leads for Q1?
I got to a place where I was not proud of the things that we had our name on, and I didn't wanna do it anymore if I couldn't be.
Yeah.
So for me, it was literally like life or death, like, I'm not gonna do this job anymore if I can't get to a place where the product is something that I love producing and am proud of the end node interactions that are coming out of our organization. And it's not like I made a conscious choice to be like, "Oh, I don't care." That it wasn't like we intentionally were frivolous about it, but I the demand was so great for a while that, like, satiating that demand became the primary objective,
Yeah.
and in that, one, there was, like the way I've just sort of described is you're building a house, and you're laying bricks, and you can really make sure they're quality bricks, there's no cracks, and they're really fit perfectly, and they're in there well, or you could just like in a hurry start stacking them and maybe they didn't set all the way and you just kind of keep going. And that's sort of what happened is we just started moving really fast and we didn't check all the bricks.
Mhm.
And that's and what ends up happening is on two sides, like when you have to hire really fast, the thoroughness with which you're vetting people and the amount of space that they have to onboard and trade goes down.
Mhm.
And then the reality is that in COVID, there was a lot of businesses that were propped up that weren't really viable businesses. So the quality of customer deteriorates as well. And so this is a bad combination of things that happen. The other thing I appreciate this from our board is I think I adopted this idea that it was actually the right thing for me to do as a leader to give individuals a lot of space to express their ideas. And so in a meeting with our board at the end towards the end of last year, it was sort of said to me like, Taylor, they're coming here for the ideas that you're creating. You have to deliver the ideas you're creating and you're selling them.
Mhm.
And so it was sort of this moment of like, oh yeah, like if our employees have an idea that's different than CTC, that's great, but this isn't the place to express those. Like you work for CTC, your job is to deliver CTC ideology, not Mikey ideology. And there's
Mhm.
nobody named Mikey, so I'm not picking on anybody. It's just an
Yeah.
example, but it's just, and that's okay. It's okay to ask that of them. And now it's not to be dogmatic and say that people can't contribute or alter the CTC ideology,
Mhm.
but you alter it at the root level as a collective. You don't alter it at the individual node level where you're just off doing Mikey's ideology. Like that's
Yeah.
fine. Go be a freelancer, go start your own thing. But if you're here, you're going to deliver CTC ideology. And I think I got to a place where I felt a lot more freedom saying that. And I think it's a weakness that I was afraid to or people pleaser or something before that I didn't, but I think that's part of it.
Yeah, yeah, totally. No, I was just thinking in terms of like what there's always to some extent a leap of faith that needs to be taken before you slow down. And I mean, it sounds like for us,
Yeah,
like part of the reason that we got to that point where we were willing to take the jump is it's just like the situation just got so bad and ultimately we weren't producing the thing that we said we were going to produce. But I'm just like struck, just in terms of thinking about the psychology of this, how much it's like, I don't know if you ever see like at the end of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where he has to cross the bridge to get to the Holy Grail, but the
right,
bridge is like
right,
painted so it looks like there's nothing there. And so
right.
you know it's there, and he jumps and he finds that the bridge is there. But every single time you return to the bridge, it still looks like it isn't there. So it always feels bad to take the leap. And so I think that there's a
Yep.
certain amount of like reps you need to take or courage that needs to be gained by just deciding that you're going to slow down and do things the right way. And I will say, like, even from my perspective, it always feels bad to say, like, oh, we're gonna take a step back here and not pursue,
I
you know. Go ahead.
I was having this conversation at dinner last night with Tony, our VP of paid media, where we were describing a customer that has a core belief about attribution that's different than ours.
Mhm,
And what it got to for me was I think the answer should be we don't do this work anymore.
mhm,
That we don't change our system to try and resolve this issue for them and make the media buyer go do all these different things because why are they here? Why they're not we're not this variable service provider that just does whatever you want. That's not who we're trying to be. And so to
mhm,
break all our systems to become that for the sake of that contract is actually detrimental to who we are. And I said at the end of like sort of my spiel saying we probably shouldn't work with them, I said, I want you to know I'm afraid right now when I say that.
mhm.
That like the
Yeah.
amount of money that that contract represents, the idea of letting it go makes me afraid, but I still think we should do it.
Mhm,
And I want you to know it's okay if you're afraid. And I don't know what's going to happen. And I can't actually promise safety. But I do know that I've got done the opposite enough times to understand that the illusion that you go down that path and it creates a healthy, good thing for you is also not the case.
mhm.
And so this imaginary scenario you've created where you break your own process and value system in the name of money and it works out great for the organization is actually not true. It's actually really detrimental. And
Yeah.
so the only way is to do the other thing, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, it's interesting. Like we're at a point now, I think where we've gotten enough reps in of doing it the right way to understand that it definitely works. And then that even not being enough to say like, oh, we should maybe not get rid of this contract because that it'll still be scary no matter how how many
Totally.
times you've seen that it actually works out. Um,
Well, and there's real human consequence to it that you
yeah,
can't
totally.
pretend. Like you don't
Yeah.
like that may mean that you have too many people at that moment,
Yeah.
like and so it's not. frivolous, like always. Like it comes at real cost, but the violation of the value and ideology actually is like really corely destructive in a way that can threaten the whole thing. And that's hard to know.
Okay, so let's maybe talk through some specifics real quick, just because we've been throwing a lot of
Yeah.
words around as far as these products that we're actually creating. So let's talk to them specifically.
Yeah.
So the first off, of course, like listeners to this podcast have heard many times, we've talked about the e-commerce diagnostic toolkit. You know what it is, but maybe talk a little bit about how we're integrating that into our service more generally.
Yeah. So I believe that our big idea as an agency is expressed in another formula. Of course, that's how I like to think. And it's like this. It's growth equals strategy to the power of execution.
Hmm.
So you've heard us talk on this podcast before about our belief about strategy and how important it is. But I think the strategy is only as good as the level of execution that you have. So growth, and I could even say profitable growth, comes from strategy to the power of execution. And so I think from there, then I go down this path of, okay, how do we operationalize that idea? And I took this quote from one of your namesakes, a famous consultant by the name of Richard Rummel, who wrote a book called A Kernel of Good Strategy. And he says this, he says, a good strategy must precisely diagnose the problem being solved, set a guiding policy that will address that problem, and propose a set of coherent actions that will deliver that policy. Okay. So that's sort of the roadmap to operationalizing strategy, or in our case, operationalizing ideology. So three things here: diagnose the problem, build a plan to solve it, design a coherent set of actions, or execute against that plan. Okay. So that's what I'm trying to think about. Okay. How do we do that framework? All right. Well, here's how we do it at CTC. Step one, diagnose the problem. Guess what you did, Richard? You gave us the e commerce diagnostic. We came up with a score, a set of measures to help us get clarity on the problem, right? Your GQ score, your relationship to these inputs, it is going to be the initial part that we enter into conversations with our customers about. What is the problem? We have to get clear on this together. What is actually preventing your profitable growth?
Hmm.
Okay. So the e commerce diagnostic is our methodology, step one, where we have a consistent way to analyze and view the problems associated with a business.
Hmm.
Okay. Once we do that, sorry, you want to
No,
ask
no,
a
no.
question
Well,
about the
I
step
was
one?
just going to mention real quick that, like, yeah, part of the reason that the diagnostic toolkit was created is that there does seem to be a general problem with understanding what the problem is. And
That's
I think
right.
that there's
Yes.
a way that you can we sort of just mentioned that, like, yes, it is a wicked system, so to speak. Like, there are a lot of unknown unknowns. And so there's a way to
Yes.
default to, I'm just going to go with my gut about what I want to do and what needs to be done. And I've been hearing a lot about how ROAS is the issue, or whatever, and then you kind of go after
Exactly.
these things based
Exactly.
on intuition. And this is this the diagnostic toolkit is a way to bring those things together, where it's like, this is a systematic way to give yourself the tools to face a bunch of unknown unknowns, because at least there's more that you could know than maybe you thought was the case. You know what I mean? Like, actually, maybe you have an operational cost problem that you didn't really realize, and you didn't realize that that was affecting the quality of your marketing or whatever. So anyway, but I just wanted to say that in terms of, like, the way we're operationalizing or systematizing something that isn't can't actually be templatized. Those are two different things, and that's kind of what the diagnostic toolkit does. But anyway, okay, so that's the beginning.
Exactly. Because I think you're right that I think a lot of time is spent solving the wrong problem.
Yeah.
And that is more and more in this business. What I have noticed in my experience with my customers is that the thing we're focusing on is actually a problem because it's actually symptomatic of an underlying deeper issue
Hmm.
that, if unaddressed, is going to kill the thing. There's a great book that I read that informed a lot of my sales methodology called The Challenger Sale,
Oh yeah.
which, if you're in sales, it's a good book. And The Challenger Sale is the idea that, when it's about sort of these different personalities of people that sell, but the idea is that we are the experts, and our primary value proposition is to make a customer believe that we already understand their problem because we've encountered it and we've seen it and we can say it to them before they even tell us. The traditional sales process is this idea that you go like, tell me about your problem, and then I'll present you solutions as if they have clarity of the problem, right? And so the diagnostic is a way for us to flip the script and say, hey, we could help you tell you the problem, and then we can help to present the solution in light of the identification of the problem. And I really think that, like, if you go to the doctor, you're going to give them a general sense of your symptoms, but they're going to actually try and tell you and run a series of tests to get to the core diagnosis, right?
Mhm.
And I think that in a lot of ways, that's the role we're playing. We're the growth doctors, so to speak, to be a little cliche. And that requires us then using a set of key indicators that we have analyzed over the course of many businesses to understand what works and what doesn't. So that's absolutely like operationally a consistent way to diagnose a problem that then sets up a sets of solutions on our behalf. Because without that, the starting point is wildly variable for every customer relative to what they say they want.
Mhm.
And it doesn't set our teams up very well for absorbing the data about the customer and how to now go and act accordingly. But this gives us a very clear output around a consistent set of metrics, a set of absorbed data, a set of findings that gets handed to the operations team that they can now go service against.
Right. Okay, so let's keep moving down the list then. So after the diagnostic toolkit, let's say after the diagnosis
Yep.
occurs. So, well, actually, so I'll say like the couple of other things that you mentioned recently on Twitter were new forecasting models, and you've also mentioned that earlier in the pod.
Yep.
So maybe let's speak to that a little bit. Like, what are we doing with that? How are we kind of shifting what we did before to make it better?
That's right. So step 2 after I've diagnosed the problem is now to build a plan to solve it. And we call that the growth map at CTC. So a map is a great metaphor for this process, right? We have a destination in mind and we're going to build the actual path to that location, to that journey, and we're going to do that by forecasting the business as part of this process. So we're going to actually set up this is where you're presently headed. Under the if the future is like the historicals, this is where you will go. Then we will set goals for impacting the core inputs of the model to improve to reach a better destination, right? We call it breaking the model. We're going to
Mhm.
establish a model, and then our job is to break the model, to outperform it, to do better than what we think is going to occur. And so that growth map includes everything from a marketing calendar to channel specific media plans to detailed email and SMS send schedules to, creative ideation to financial tracking. Like it's a very rich, deep document that we've developed that functions as the core center. It's our plan. It's a planning exercise, right? And so that is identify the problem, build a plan to solve it. Richard Rummel, step 2.
Nice. Okay, so then the next piece of the puzzle here. Well, actually, so it's interesting because like so the next thing that you list here is the new statless dash and the
Yep.
growth map integration to the statless dash. So maybe let's speak to that. I don't know
Yep.
if that necessarily follows chronologically, but how
Well,
does
it
that
does it. It actually sets up and functions in part 3, what we call the P3 system.
right?
So if step 1 is diagnose the problem, step 2 is build a plan to solve it, and then step 3 is build a coherent set of actions or operationalize, like go execute.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, we have what we call the P3 system. That's our methodology for executing, and it's plot, pivot, profit. Plot, pivot, profit. So the idea is we have a map. Every day we plot the point on the map. So what does that mean? That means we track a bunch of data and its performance to expectation every single day. And so that's what the statless dashboard is it's a view of your performance across 25 different metrics every single day. So that's plotting. Plot your progress against expectation. Where am I? Am I on the trail? Am I off the trail for my map every single day? Okay. Then relative to where you're at, pivot your direction. So if I'm off course, pivot. If my AOV is lower than I thought, pivot your offer. If my CAC's too high, pivot your cost cap, right? If my volume's too low, pivot my budget up, right? If my email returning customer revenue is down, pivot my email send schedule, right? There's a set of actions that lead to an outcome of profit all the way through the system. And the statless dashboard is what allows us to see that and action against it, right? And so all of these things, diagnose the problem, build the growth map, use the P3 system, are how we and every person at CTC is taught to operationalize the ideology that you're paying for.
Right. And yeah, I think an important point to make here about the specifically the growth. So this is the growth map integration with the statless dash. So the
That's
idea
right. So
being
that
then like
exactly.
yeah, yeah. So you have your map, and then what the map does is it pulls signals into our proprietary software, Statless, for those who don't know, that kind of brings all your data together and puts it in one place. And so the idea is then your map is sort of automatically giving you signals on a daily basis about where you need to go. And that takes a lot of
You're
the
on or off
guesswork out of it.
course.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're
That's
like,
right.
yeah, we're not
You
going in the right
can't
direction. We got to change.
here's the great secret about every dashboard that exists in the marketing world, and I'm going to be bold with this, is that there is nobody, nobody that could look at a dashboard of data and tell you whether it's good or bad.
Hmm.
You can't. You're lacking the expectation of each number. What were you trying to do? Were you trying to generate that revenue number? Now we could go,
Yeah.
oh, it's $2 million. That's cool. But if you find out they were trying to generate three, it's not good, right? Data without context, data without expectation is useless.
Hmm.
So the growth map creates the expectation, right? And then Statless actualizes it. So imagine it's like when you go to put your address in for where you're going, it builds you a map. It shows you the trail, right? And so you have a visual of which way you should be going. And then when you go off course, it lets you know, hey, hold on, you're not going the right way. But without the initial plan, without the initial expectation, the actual numbers are useless. And so the
Right.
combination of these things, the expectation and the actual, is the key to success.
Yeah. I think the fantastic thing about Statless is that it's a dashboard of data that is built with our ideology in mind at its core. So I think like a
That's
lot
right.
of marketing dashboards just sort of give you information and that's it without really having a sense of like directionally what should that information tell you. And so I know like this is probably or this is changing, but for instance, the way that Statless is built around the formula is a good example of
Yes.
like how we even started Statless based off this idea. Like this is our core belief about how e-commerce works. This is all the data that you need that ladders up into these sort of basic metrics. And I think that
It's
that's
another
like,
great example.
yeah,
Like
it's completely unique.
I wrote a document once called How to Solve a Problem. And we used to pass this around CTC. And the idea was you encounter an account that's struggling. Here's how you solve the problem. And what that document went through was okay, visitors, conversion rate, AOV, profit. Like, here's all the things to check. Here's what to look for to identify the solution. And so we took that sort of framework and we took all the places that you would look for those things that I identified under the visitor section and we built a report for it. And so that was the initial Statless outline was all around this idea of how to solve the problem, and now since then it's evolved to what our methodology has become, but that is exactly right. It's another example of here's an equation for analyzing things. Okay, cool. Well, how do you turn that into what do I do every day? Is actually where the real obligation for the organization is.
Right. Cool. All right. So, and then the final product here, we obviously, you guys talked about it last week, is the
Yeah.
D2CCI, the Direct to Consumer
Mhm.
Confidence Index, which is a live updated index of how people are feeling about the economy, about their own spending power, and so on and so forth. Now, we've talked about this recently. What I want to know is how do you see this as integrated into the
Yeah.
rest of our ideology?
Great question. So my hope is right now it's at the research phase, which is where a lot of these products begin, right? Like we had to
Mhm.
go research the diagnostic and which metrics we should use. Our hope is that it becomes a key input into the forecast, right? Is that right now what we use to forecast is historical data about a brand's performance over time that we assume will be like the future. But what we know is that the business existed in a different context when those numbers were created. And the easiest illustration of this is like everybody's COVID numbers are not really useful in predicting their 2023 behavior. So the historical data is often not predictive of the future data. So what we're trying to find is inputs that would allow us to understand the data in context of the macro environment. And if we can see those relationships and we can tease them out, then we can begin to layer in better contextual forecasting that would say, hey, that efficiency at that time or that retention performance at that time was actually a function of the brand seasonality and the macroeconomic environment. And now the macroeconomic environment is less or better or worse. And so let's think about how that would affect future performance. So the key is that ideally it becomes a model or an input in our model for forecasting. So it's at that growth map level and then it also becomes a part of the D2C index, which is a cool lead gen magnet that get people into our story as well. And so that's sort of the two prongs that the DTCCI is going to provide us a proprietary data set that we can train models on and a really cool thing to get people into our funnel and into the CTC ecosystem and interacting with us.
Yeah. Cool. So this I guess has been in some senses an extended ad for CTC. We're doing a lot of a lot of great stuff. But one thing that I want to maybe leave our listeners with is to go back to kind of the initial way that we were framing this, which is around the ability to turn ideology into product, to
Yeah.
operationalize thought work. If you could leave brand owners, agency owners, whatever, with one piece of advice about how to bring about this change where they have an ideology, they have a framework, and then
Mhm.
they're turning it into something that their people believe in and are executing on. What would you say is the one thing that you can do today to make that happen?
So I think that it begins with your own personal clarity. So if we go back to the 4 steps to accomplishing it, right? It begins with, have you written down your ideology? Like, does it exist in a way that someone could go and read or consume?
Hmm.
Not did you say it once in a meeting, but like, does it exist in written form? And then I would ask yourself the second question, which is, if you were to come up with a set of questions about that ideology, what percentage of people inside of your organization would answer them the same? And if you just think about those 2 things, and this is a lot, like, this could be around values, this could be around specific, if you're a service business, like what your product or service actually is.
Hmm.
If you're selling a product, it could be how you describe that product. If it's a piece of software, it's like, what does it do? Why is it valuable? Who's it for? Like all these kinds of questions. And I think that you'll find that the organizational integrity, the alignment between behaviors and beliefs is lower than you expect. So step one is to challenge yourself to say, do I have a clear ideology that I can communicate? Um,
Hmm.
and I'll just say that that's hard to do. And it probably takes more than you think to get clear for yourself. Because even if you think you're clear for yourself, I've repeatedly learned that I think I've said something a bunch of times. And this goes back to me talking about Meta, right? And ASC Plus. It's
Yeah.
like, and how well they did this. What is ASC Plus? Why does it matter? What's the data that validates it? How do I make sure everybody knows that?
Hmm.
Simple, clear, actionable. You know, these are hard things to create.
Yeah.
And so go right. That's
Yeah.
the first thing I would do.
I think it's useful to think through examples of how this is done well, even outside of the agency world. Because for an agency, I mean, like we are just an ideas factory, basically. And so starting
Yeah.
with an ideology is maybe kind of easier. But I think about, for instance, I know Trader Joe's is really good at this in terms of like having a core idea about what a shopping experience could be and then getting everybody on
Yeah.
board with it. And then I think like one instance from TJ's, this is sort of inside baseball because my wife worked there once upon a time, but you're basically allowed to just steal from the store if you want to and they won't stop you because that is how
Hmm.
far they will go to saying like we don't want you to feel bothered by your experience when you're in Trader Joe's no matter what. And if there's a little bit of
That's right.
risk, which is actually not that high because nobody's gonna do that really, they're able to create an environment where you feel as the shopper completely safe, perhaps. So like I don't know if you can think of any other examples of that, but like just maybe
Well, I
on the
think what you're
product side.
describing,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, Ben Horowitz has this idea, I think that you're getting at, which is that like sometimes culturally organizations need to create an outlandish rule
Hmm.
that proves the point of the value. And so I think that, and he uses this example of, gosh, I'm going to butcher this historically, but a leader that was leading a slave rebellion, and he made a rule that no one was allowed to rape or pillage after they took over and won some battles. And it was like counter to what like anybody would have said, but it established this. He was trying to elevate their view of themselves.
Hmm.
And so he would say this normative behavior that when you're a victor, you get to take the spoils. Like, we're going to make a rule that says we don't do that for the sake of proving the identity attribute he was trying to get them to understand.
Hmm.
And so I think with product or anything else is that oftentimes the cultural idea that you're trying to instill is probably not naturally present in every person. And so
Yeah.
sometimes that extreme rule gives you the opportunity to validate it. Like I think about, we just a stupid example, and we don't have it here because we're on Riverside, but we just right now we have new set of new CTC values, right? And one of them's about this idea of setting the standard for the experience that we're providing or the way we do things. And I've thought a lot about people's Zoom backgrounds and how, like, the reality is that that's a really hard thing to sort of
Hmm.
create a consistent, elevated experience around, because in fairness to everybody, we're all in our houses, we're all doing the best we can with the space that we have available to us, and your background's a bookcase and mine's this window and somebody else's is their bedroom because they live in a one-bedroom apartment, whatever. And so we created all these Zoom backgrounds that are now default on for everybody. That is just like a way to say there's a standard, there's a consistent shared experience of us.
Hmm.
And so, like, you're just trying to find little ways to instill the idea. that you're going after and to find every little place that it's not present and create little elevations of it. And I think just whatever it is, like, at Kalo, they wanted to the idea was that marriage is a playful space in your life, and it's where adventure can still exist. It's not the ball and they wanted to sort of do away with all the, marriage metaphors of like, the ball and chain or,
Hmm.
like this, like that's where life ends. And so they wanted to still see it as a time that was adventurous. And so they used to give every employee an adventure day once a month. And but to use it, what you had to do was you had to go do something you'd never done before, and you had to document it and come back and share it with the company. Okay, and so that's a way in which the ideology that they're trying to create for the customer and the brand is invited people into in a way that like stretches them in this sort of abnormal way, but it says like this is the lifestyle that we want to embody, and
Hmm.
so we're going to go after it. And so I think there's little ways that you just try and again, operationalize ideology in a way that is tactile and interacted with in a very real way.
Yeah. The example that came to mind as you were speaking too is like the idea of taking a central like a business ideology and turning it in and being sort of relentless about pursuing it. And the example I'm thinking of course, is Amazon and Jeff Bezos, which is this
Yeah.
idea
Right.
that the core ideology of Amazon is not really about like books or whatever it happened to be when they came out in the 90s. It's a relentless focus on customer experience, customer experience, customer
That's
experience.
it.
And that is
That's right.
the extreme that they go to the point where, like there's obviously certain issues with that. But at the
Right.
same time, like they are relentless about like if you okay, what would be awesome for the customer if you ordered it and it came the same day? Let's make that happen. And so I think that there's some sort of there I think even getting to the ideology of customer service is the thing that we are focusing on is also really difficult. And I think that's kind of the thing you
Yes.
need to, what is the germ? What is the thing that you need to figure out there?
Right. That's the clarity. And then you think about how to operationalize it. So, and the other thing, just to leave with too, is that I think there's a common trope in the world that like the way to evaluate an agency is to evaluate the people.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying that shouldn't be part of the product process, that you shouldn't meet the team. But the question is, what are you evaluating them for?
Yeah.
Right? Are you evaluating their individual talent? Are you evaluating their resume? Because the reality is like you're not going to actually interview them, not at the level that you would if they were going to be employees. So the idea that you're going to get a call for 30 minutes and assess them, I think is pretty short-sighted as a way to actually instead what I would evaluate is I would ask the agency to to have clarity of their ideology and how it's operationalized inside of the organization, to tell you about the processes, the measurement, and the execution of the ideas that they're sharing across the current customer base, right? So that they can show you that like the things that they say they're going to do are done regardless of who the person is. Because the reality is like over the course of a relationship, people are going to get promoted, they're going to take new jobs. That part is going to be transient, but you didn't actually hire them because of that individual person's skill. You hired them because of the organizational ideology and experience. So how is it operationalized? That's the question I would ask.
Cool. All right. Well, I think that'll do it for us this week. Thanks again for joining us, everybody, and we'll see you on the next one.